declare a recess of the committee at any time. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 7683, the Artificial Intelligence Training for the Acquisition Workforce Act. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 7683, the Artificial Intelligence Training for the Acquisition Workforce Act.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7683, offered by Ms. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as a base text for purposes of the amendment. I now recognize myself to speak in support of H.R. 7683, the Artificial Intelligence Training for the Acquisition Workforce Act, introduced by myself and our distinguished ranking member, Mr. Comer. This bill is the House companion to S-2551, led by our Senate counterparts, Chairman Peters and Ranking Member Portman. We're proud to work in partnership to ensure the federal acquisition and program management workforce has the skills and expertise necessary to make decisions that are well-informed of both the capabilities and risks associated with artificial intelligence, or AI. Advances in AI are changing the nature of the work around the globe, and the important work of the federal government is no exception. AI presents a constantly evolving set of tools that have become essential to the global race to solve societal changes, protect national security, and remain economically competitive. At the same time, the algorithms that drive AI systems present new challenges to oversight and accountability efforts that require rigorous approaches to transparency and governance to preserve privacy and civil liberties and to protect the public interest. According to market research, the federal government doubled its spending on AI from fiscal year 2018 to fiscal year 2020 and is on track to spend close to $1 billion on AI by the next year. It is essential that we equip our acquisition and program management workforce with the skills and expertise they need to understand this technology and its full implications. The National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, for example, has warned that federal agencies who fail to adequately train their acquisition workforce on AI will instead be forced to rely on the judgment of contractors and therefore unable to make informed decisions in the best interest of agency missions and the public. To address these concerns, the AI Training Act would require the Office of Management and Budget, in coordination with the General Services Administration, to develop and implement an AI training program for relevant federal workers, including acquisition and program management employees. The program would cover the science underlying AI, introductory concepts, potential benefits of technology, and future trends. Most importantly, the program would cover the risks posed by AI, including discrimination, risk to privacy, as well as ways to mitigate such risks by pursuing AI that is reliable, safe, and trustworthy. The training program, would be updated at least every 2 years, ensuring it remains relevant to the constant evolution of this field. It would also create and require the creation of metrics to ensure the participation of relevant federal workers and to receive feedback for the improvement of the program. For federal workers to fully safeguard against the risk and realize the benefits of AI in the workplace, increased attention is needed at all stages of education, training, and workforce development. The AI Training Act will ensure that investments of taxpayer dollars in AI are leveraged ethically and responsibly, with privacy and civil liberties protections centered in decision-making to create billions of dollars in added productivity that bring greater benefits to the American people and allow the federal workforce to achieve goals that were previously beyond reach. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back. Who else seeks recognition? The ranking member is recognized.
Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney. Artificial intelligence helps simplify our everyday lives, from navigation apps to spam filters to asking Siri who won the Kentucky Derby. The federal government also uses AI to improve government services and efficiency. But AI is a complex technology and can easily be misused. To date, there have not been a collective effort to train the federal workforce that identifies, buys, and manages AI capabilities. The AI Training for the Acquisition Workforce Act establishes a government-wide training program for federal workers responsible for AI program management and acquisition. This training will help ensure the consistent and safe procurement and use of AI products across the federal government. I appreciate the Chairwoman working with me on this legislation. I'm pleased to be an original co-sponsor. The AI Training Act is a good government bill and ensures Americans' investment in government is well spent. This is an example of work the Oversight Committee is supposed to be doing. But unfortunately, this committee, under Democrat leadership, has largely strayed from its mission to root out waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement in the federal government. Americans across the nation are facing crises after crises because of Democrat one-party rule in Washington. The House Oversight and Reform Committee is supposed to hold the federal government accountable. But this committee is asleep at the switch when it comes to conducting oversight of the Biden administration. In fact, this committee has no hearings this week, zero. Meanwhile, record inflation resulting from Democrats' out-of-control spending continues to rise. President Biden's supply chain crisis continues to worsen. Many grocery store shelves are empty. Now there's a severe shortage of infant formula that is crushing moms and babies. Gas prices continue to skyrocket as President Biden and Democrats on this committee wage war against America's energy producers. The price for a gallon of gas is at a record $4.37 per gallon. President Biden's border crisis is set to become catastrophic later this month when the Biden administration ends Title 42 expulsions. But the Oversight Committee is nowhere to be found on these issues and more. We should be holding hearings with Biden administration officials such as Department of Energy Secretary Granholm, DHS Secretary Mayorkas, and others about how they plan to address the Biden administration's self-inflicted crises that are causing the American people to suffer. The American people expect us to advocate on their behalf. Let's return to our committee's mission and get to work on behalf of the American people. Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. And I'd like to point out to him that we released a report today, yesterday too, on Emergent, a firm that got a $600 million sole source contract from the Trump administration. The Biden administration canceled this contract, saving taxpayers today $320 million because the report shows that they had to destroy 400 million vaccines that our American public need, other people need, the world needs, but because of their mismanagement that was noted by their own employees. They said things like, the risk is too high, I can't sleep at night, it's not being managed properly. This is Emergent employees talking. I suggest that the distinguished friend of mine and ranking member read the report and see how we just saved taxpayers' money. Now, when it comes to the economy, let me point out that 8.4 million jobs have been created under the Biden administration so far, and the GDP is growing faster at a faster rate since 1984. Even though inflation is currently outpacing wage growth, strong demand in the labor force is helping workers secure better jobs with higher pay. Average hourly earnings are up 5.5% over the last year, the strongest wage growth since we've seen in years. And wages among the lowest income workers increased almost 6.1% over the last 12 months, which contrasts with the Great Recession when their wages did not recover until 2019. Job openings are at record highs, increasing worker bargaining power and bringing marginalized workers back into the workforce. I would also like to place into the record a listing of 24 hearings that we have had in this committee with government representatives from the administration. Without objection, we'll place it into the record. And I would like to say that we need to get back to the topic of this hearing. Let's get back to the topic of this markup. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Norman is now recognized.
Thank you, Chair Maloney. You know, as I look at this bill, and getting back to what Congressman Comer said, you know, we're good at passing legislation that adds to our deficit. You know, I don't know if I have seen the description of what this bill is going to cover. To provide a training program on artificial intelligence. I don't know what that means. I do know what it means from a standpoint of the CBO saying that it's going to cost us $9 million from 2021 to 2026. You know, there are no offsets anywhere that I've seen on anything this administration has done. I will also add, Chairman Maloney, that as far as the state of the economy in this country, I think if you do a poll right now, you would see Americans are sick of inflation eating up their paycheck. They're sick of paying 60% more for gas. They're sick of empty lines, empty shelves at our grocery stores. They're sick of illegals coming across the border. The list goes on and on. And I think to burden this country with another bill that adds to the deficit with no offsets makes no sense. And I will be definitely voting against this. I yield back.
Will the gentleman yield?
The gentleman yields back. He mentioned the deficit. The deficit is expected to decrease by $1.5 trillion this year, and this stands in stark contrast to former President Trump, who increased the national debt by more than $1 trillion by cutting taxes for corporations and wealthy Americans. So I'd say if Republicans are serious about addressing inflation and reducing prices for America's working families, I urge with them to work with us to reduce energy and prescription drug costs and to create jobs. We are now working on, actually tomorrow, there will be a meeting with Mr. Comer and others on this committee on the America's Competes Act, which was bipartisan in the Senate and is focused really on bringing down inflation and helping American workers. But let's get back to the topic of this markup, or we will never end it. Who else seeks recognition? Is there anyone else who seeks recognition on the bill before us? So seeing no one, the question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. 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 All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 7683 as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. H.R. 7683 shall be favorably reported to the House without objection. A motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the matters considered by the committee in this markup. Okay, pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 7331, the Improving Government for America's Taxpayer Act. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 7331, to require the Comptroller General of the United States to provide certain information with respect to unimplemented priority recommendations as part of the Comptroller General's annual reporting to Congress and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7331, offered by Ms. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as a base text for purposes of amendment. I now recognize myself. I strongly support the Improving Government for America's Taxpayer Act, and I want to thank Chair Derek Kilmer and Vice Chairman William Timmons of the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress for introducing this bill. I would also like to thank Ranking Member James Comer and fellow committee members, Representatives Conley, Mace, Krishnamurthy, Norman, and Porter, for co-sponsoring this bill. This bipartisan bill would push for better implementation of recommendations made to Congress by the Government Accountability Office. The Improving Government for America's Taxpayer Act would direct GAO to consolidate recommendations to Congress in one succinct report. The bill also directs GAO to identify any additional congressional oversight actions that could assist agencies in implementing their open priority recommendations. Implementing GAO's recommendations to agencies in Congress could help improve government's efficiency and save taxpayers money. As we seek greater transparency and accountability within our federal government, I appreciate the bipartisanship taken on this bill. I urge all of my colleagues to support this bill. I yield back. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Comer? Yes. Mr. Comer is now recognized the distinguished ranking member.
Thank you, Chairwoman.
You're on the right one.
Yeah, okay. This one. My microphone wasn't working. Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney. The Government Accountability Office serves an important oversight role. They provide Congress with insights into the federal bureaucracy. However, in 2021, GAO had more than 100 unimplemented recommendations that could improve government efficiency and save taxpayer dollars. To better address these issues, I joined my colleagues, Representative Derek Kilmer and Representative William Timmons, as an original co-sponsor on the Improving Government for America's Taxpayers Act. The bill will annually consolidate open GAO recommendations for congressional leadership and relevant committees to consider. It will include the estimated costs associated with these open recommendations. H.R. 7331 will enable Congress to address issues of waste and mismanagement across the government at specific agencies. I strongly urge my colleagues to support this smart bipartisan bill, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? Does anyone else seek recognition? Seeing no one, the question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to you. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 7331 as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. H.R. 7331 shall be favorably reported to the House. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the matters considered by the committee in this markup. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 7535, the Quantum Competing Cybersecurity Preparedness Act. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 7535 to encourage the migration of federal government information technology systems to quantum resistance, cryptography, and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7535, offered by Ms. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for purposes of amendment. I now recognize myself to speak in support of 7535, the Quantum Computing Cybersecurity Preparedness Act. Last year, our colleague, Representative Ro Khanna, came to me about a grave national security threat looming on the horizon. Today, the processes we use to encrypt data are incredibly reliable, and can keep sensitive data secure from unauthorized users during storage or transmission. But tomorrow, that may no longer be the case. Researchers around the world are accelerating advances toward quantum computing, or the application of quantum physics to allow computers to perform calculations many magnitudes faster and more powerfully than they can today. While quantum computers have the potential to provide considerable benefits to society through unimaginable innovation, it is also increasingly likely that they could equip our adversaries with the ability to break the best encryptions we are capable of today. Capabilities of this magnitude are estimated to still be a decade or more in the future. But China and other adversaries are expected to begin stealing sensitive encrypted data much sooner, with the intent of unlocking it when they have the capability to do so. It is essential that the federal government prepare for this inevitability now, while we still have time to protect data that is critical to our national and economic security. The process of migrating all federal IT systems to post-quantum cryptography will be complex and costly, but putting the right steps in place now will enable us to stay at the forefront of this developing frontier. I want to applaud Representative Ro Khanna, as well as our colleagues Representative Nancy Mace and Jerry Connolly, for putting forth a thoughtful, bipartisan bill to establish that very process. H.R. 7535 would require the Office of Management and Budget to quickly issue guidance requiring federal agencies to create and maintain inventories of all cryptographic systems currently in use, as well as all federally IT systems that could be vulnerable to future quantum computers. Within a year, OMB would be required to submit to Congress a strategy for addressing the risks posed by quantum computing, allowing time for assessment of this strategy. Before the National Institute of Standards and Technology is expected to issue its post-quantum cryptographic standards in 2024. OMB would then be required to issue guidance requiring agencies to develop a plan to migrate their IT systems to post-quantum cryptography using those standards and to consult with the Chief Information Officer's Council to prioritize agency IT systems for migrations based on risk. OMB would also submit an annual report to Congress on progress towards transitioning federal agencies to the new standards. These requirements are reflected in the ANS under consideration today, which better aligns the bill with the National Security Memorandum released by the Biden-Harris administration late last week. This critical memorandum takes important strides to advance U.S. leadership in quantum computing by strengthening collaboration and partnership with private sector leaders, securing critical capabilities, and making strategic investments. It also establishes the administration's policy to transition federal IT systems to quantum-resistant cryptography, precisely what this bill would accomplish. I applaud the Biden-Harris administration for leading on this important issue and setting forth an aggressive yet reasonable roadmap to both maximize the benefits and minimize the threats of quantum computing for the United States. The bill before us today provides more concrete direction to support this vision, and I urge my colleagues to support it. I yield back. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Comer, our distinguished ranking member, is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Quantum computing holds great promise and potential peril. It promises to exponentially increase computing power and processing speeds. While such major advances are likely decades away, there's a clear risk that foreign adversaries like China will use future developed quantum computers to unlock data they've already stolen from federal agencies. Encryption protects the privacy, security, and integrity of underlying data and is nearly impossible to decrypt with today's computers. But as quantum computing matures, so does the possibility that sensitive information could easily be unlocked. This is a national security threat. I support the bill's intent to establish a government-wide strategy to better secure valuable government data from malicious adversaries. However, there will likely be costs associated with the bill's requirements, and the government already has initiatives underway to address such emerging threats. That's why we need to make sure we work with other congressional committees to ensure our strategies are thorough and relevant. I thank my colleagues for bringing this bill before the committee, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Conley is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you to your thoughts and those of Mr. Comer on this important bill. We need to pass this bill for two broad reasons. One is our continuing commitment to upgrading federal information technology capabilities. The federal government we've identified over the series of lots of hearings, especially in our subcommittee, Mr. Heiss and I have uncovered, I think, strengths and weaknesses, especially during the pandemic. But specifically, there's also the issue of competitiveness with China. China is going to emerge as our largest single adversary and competitor. China has decided in the technology realm to dominate in three broad areas that are really critical. One is 5G, and we've responded to that in trying to block Huawei and other Chinese firms from dominating that market. Artificial intelligence is the second area they want to dominate. And again, we've stepped up our efforts to be competitive. But the third is this one, quantum computing. If China were to, in fact, dominate these three critical areas of future technology, we are handing over our future to the Chinese. It is imperative that our government be prepared to meet this competitive threat. This bill is an important step in doing that. I congratulate Mr. Khanna in introducing the bill. I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor, and I join you and Mr. Comer in urging our colleagues to adopt this important piece of legislation. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and I thank you for your leadership on this issue. I now recognize Mr. Clyde. Mr. Clyde is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question. I do not see a CBO score on this particular bill, and I realize that you know, when it comes to computers and you know, advances in technology, that can be rather expensive. I think, can you tell me, Madam Chair, do we actually have a CBO score on this bill?
We do not have one at this point, but before it goes to the floor, we will.
Okay, all right. I would appreciate knowing that, because I think it's fiscally responsible that when we move a bill forward out of markup, that we know what the cost is. I think that's being a good steward of the public trust. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. Norman is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I just agree with Congressman Clyde. To vote on something, not know the cost, is irresponsible on our committee's part. I also would say that the discussion ought to be had here exactly what's the game plan for protecting against quantum computing. I think if you ask 435 members of Congress to define quantum computing and the cybersecurity protections, they couldn't come up with it. I think it's up to us before we vote on something to have this list available, and more importantly, to have the number of people and the costs that the CBO comes up with before we consider it here. So I think this cart before the horse, and I would urge this committee to vote this down until we have more information that'll give us something to go by. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his thoughtful statement, but the procedure really is in this committee is to vote it out of the committee before getting a CBO score to show there is serious consideration. CBO scores, as you know, take a long time. I can assure you it will never go to the floor without a CBO score, but I'm pleased that the author of this important bill is now with us, and I'd like now to recognize Ro Khanna. You are now recognized, Mr. Ro Khanna.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your leadership on this bill, as well as Chair Connolly's leadership. And I want to, of course, recognize Representative Mace. We've worked on this bill together. The bill, very simply, will make sure that we are protected against quantum computing hacks into our security. Let me just put it very, very simply. Right now, obviously, quantum computing can increase the ability, the power of computers to break code. So if you have computers that can try a lot of combinations really fast and many times, then they can figure out what the right combination is to get into your iPhone or to get into your system, because they can just try passwords many, many times. And they can break through even encryption. What we want to do is make sure that our government, our national security is protected against quantum computing so that our algorithms and encryption are strong enough, even if you have very high-powered computing. I have a tremendous amount of respect for my friend, Representative Norman. He's the ranking member on the Environment Committee. We have great exchanges. He's always very respectful, and I completely appreciate his perspective on making sure that we understand what quantum computing is. And I am committed with Representative Mace to help make sure that that's clear. And as the chair indicated, it's a CBO score that we will have. I don't think this is going to cost the government a significant amount of money at all. It's more about just being prepared for attacks and being prepared from attacks from China in particular, and security. So I hope the representative will consider voting for it, though, of course, our friendship and my respect for him will remain regardless. He's really a pleasure to work with, always tries to reach across the aisle. And I appreciate the work that both the majority and minority staff has done on this bill. I want to thank again Representative Mace and you, Chair Maloney, and Chair Connolly for your leadership.
The gentleman yields back, and we thank you for your leadership. Does anyone else seek recognition? Hearing no one, the question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 7535 as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. H.R. 7535 shall be favorably reported to the House. Without objection, a motion to reconsider it. Pardon me?
We had a member ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. A recorded vote is so ordered. And pursuant to Clause 2 of Rules 11 and Committee Rule 5B, proceedings on the amendment are postponed. Okay, pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 521, the First Responder Fair Return for Employees on Their Initial Retirement Earned Act of 2021. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 521, the First Responder Fair Return for Employees on Their Initial Retirement Earned Act.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 521, offered by Ms. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as a base text for purposes of amendment. I now recognize the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Conley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank you for bringing up H.R. 521, the First Responder Fair Retire Act. Federal firefighters and law enforcement officers put their lives on the line for their fellow Americans every day. This week, we celebrate National Police Week, where we honor appropriately our law enforcement community and thank those who risk it all for public safety every day. America needs and depends on the brave men and women who fill these demanding, arduous, and hazardous duty positions. Those men and women who bear this burden face the very real potential that an on-the-job injury could leave them disabled and unable to return to service. Given the hazardous nature of the job required of federal first responders, Congress created an accelerated retirement system for those positions and established a mandatory retirement age of 57. Referred to as 6C for the section of the law in which the retirement system was established, federal first responders are entitled to an annuity after serving for 20 years and reaching the age of 50. They pay a greater percentage of their salary into that retirement system, and their annuity amount is calculated at a higher rate than other federal employees who make that payment over the course of 30 years. Unfortunately, not all federal first responders are able to complete their 20 years of service. In cases where federal first responders become injured and are no longer able to complete the essential functions of their jobs, they may be placed in a civil service position that does not qualify for these 6C benefits. Any federal first responder transferred to the federal employee retirement system loses eligibility to retire after 20 years of service. Additionally, the employee is not reimbursed for those higher contributions he or she has paid into during that period of time when they were qualified for the 6C retirement system. The years of service are credited as if the federal first responder had been in the normal 30-year system, and the federal government keeps the overpayments. The First Responder Fair Retire Act offers a technical correction to current law, authorizing federal first responders to stay in the 6C retirement system if they are placed in a position outside of that system after returning to work after a duty-related injury. The bill also allows those employees to receive a refund of their accelerated contributions if, in fact, they are separated from service before they're entitled to the annuity. The First Responder Fair Retire Act allows the federal government to uphold the retirement promise it made to its first responders. These first responders are Capitol Hill police officers, Secret Service agents, and other federal law enforcement officers and firefighters across numerous federal agencies. For example, Bob Beckley was a smoke jumper with the U.S. Forest Service. He parachuted out of a plane in 1985 and landed in a tree at the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness area in Idaho when trying to stop a fire. The tree's branches broke, dropping Mr. Beckley 80 feet and breaking his back in 5 places. He died twice before he could be evacuated. After his recovery, Mr. Beckley, 10 years into the firefighting career, chose to work for the Forest Service in another position. But the reward for his bravery and service and injuries was his removal from the 6C retirement system. He watched his firefighter brothers and sisters all retire with full benefits after 20 years of service, but not him. We want to incentivize brave first responders to continue their service to this nation. We should not punish them for injuries they sustained protecting the rest of us. And we should reward their actions with continued inclusion in the retirement system they signed up for at the start of their service, commensurate with the risks they undertake. The bill is endorsed by the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association, the National Fraternal Order of Police, the National Federation of Federal Employees, the International Association of Firefighters, the National Association of Police Organizations, the National Treasury Employees Union, and the Senior Executives Association, and I urge my colleagues to adopt this bill. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you for your work on this important bill. Who else seeks recognition? The distinguished ranking member, Mr. Comer, is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our federal public safety officers put their lives on the line day in and day out. The First Responder Fair Retire Act provides permanently injured public safety officers the option, if they choose, to continue their federal service in a civilian capacity and continue paying into their accelerated law enforcement retirement plans. I don't believe that our federal law enforcement officers should risk losing their retirement benefits when disabled in the line of duty. I also believe this bill is narrowly tailored to help those we intend to help. First, it only applies to federal law enforcement agents and public safety officers who already pay into an accelerated retirement system. Second, it only applies to injuries sustained while on duty and as a direct result of the performance of such duties. And finally, it only applies to public safety officers who choose to continue their federal service in a civilian capacity and who continue to pay into the accelerated annuity. If they leave federal service, they are not eligible for the election. I'm pleased to support this common sense bill during Police Week, and I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
Would my friend just yield for a second?
Yes.
I just want to thank him for his support. I think this is really an important measure, and it's a good thing we're moving forward on a bipartisan basis. I thank the distinguished ranking member.
Thank you.
Who else seeks recognition? I now recognize myself to speak in support of this very important bill, H.R. 521, the First Responder Fair Retire Act, introduced by Government Operations Subcommittee Chairman Conley, along with Representatives Fitzpatrick and Langevin. H.R. 521 makes an important change to statute governing retirement programs for federal first responders and law enforcement officials who become disabled on the job. Currently, employees in these positions are enrolled in an enhanced retirement program, which requires that they retire from their positions by age 57 or after 20 years of service. They contribute a great percentage of their pay to the retirement system and civil service employees to account for their earlier collection of retirement benefits. Under current law, when an employee who is covered under the enhanced retirement program becomes injured and disabled in the course of their work before they reach retirement age, they become ineligible for the retirement program that they have been paying into since the beginning of their employment. They lose the benefits they earned during their career before becoming disabled. The employees covered under this bill are law enforcement officers, Customs and Border Protection officers, firefighters, air traffic controllers, nuclear materials couriers, Capitol Police, Supreme Court police, certain CIA employees, and diplomatic security special agents of the Department of State. These positions are central to our national security and come with a high level of personal risk. Denying them the retirement that they were guaranteed when they entered public service is simply unfair. This bill preserves those retirement benefits for disabled first responders and law enforcement who choose to continue their careers with the federal government. The bill is supported by an array of federal employee unions who represent first responders and law enforcement officials. These employees can continue to contribute their valuable experience in other federal government positions, and they should not be penalized or discouraged from doing so by an unfair retirement structure. The men and women who sign up for dangerous jobs to serve our nation should not be punished if they sustain injuries on the job and choose to continue their career in public service in a new capacity. I hope that all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will join me in supporting H.R. 521, and I thank Mr. Conley for his leadership and Mr. Comer for his leadership on this bill that enjoys bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate. I yield back, and who else seeks recognition?
Chairman.
Mr. Norman.
Mr. Norman, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Maloney. Yeah, I want to, in a positive note, say I do like this bill, Congressman Conley. It's narrowly focused. I think it affects those who need our support now than as ever before. They're underpaid as it is. It affects 20 people now. That will grow, but this is how a bill ought to be drafted, and I want to congratulate you for that. I yield back.
Now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 521 as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is agreed to. H.R. 521 will be favorably reported to the House without objection. A motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the matters considered by the committee in this markup. Pursuant to notice, I now call up 7674, the Ensuring Oversight Access at the Postal Service Act. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 7674 to provide members of Congress access to United States Postal Service facilities and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7674, offered by Ms. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as a base text for purposes of amendment. I now recognize the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Conley, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair, and I thank you for bringing up H.R. 7674, the Ensuring Oversight Access to the Postal Service Act, today. On October 2nd, 2020, I requested a tour of the Merrifield Postal Distribution Center in my congressional district, the 11th District of Virginia, one of the largest distribution centers in all of metropolitan Washington and certainly the largest in Northern Virginia. Postal Service officials denied me access to the facility, citing the Hatch Act, of all things. The implication seemed to be that either I or the Postal Service employees would be unable to refrain from launching into partisan political activities in our visit. On October 13th, I sent a letter to the Postal Service asking them for a written copy of their legal analysis of the Hatch Act, which, they state, requires a prohibition on member visits to postal facilities in the 45 days leading up to a primary or general election. On October 20th, 2020, the Postal Service sent me a second letter claiming their Hatch Act policy was approved by the Office of Special Counsel. That claim is simply untrue. In fact, the Office of Special Counsel wrote a letter to Chairwoman Carolyn Maloney and myself on October 13th of 2020, clearly stating that the Hatch Act does not prevent members of Congress from executing their oversight duties and responsibilities through tours or other constitutionally required actions. The opinion of the Postal Service was flat wrong, and they made it up. They made it up about the Office of Special Counsel. The OSC letter further stated that members of Congress who are candidates for partisan political office are not barred from visiting federal facilities to execute their official oversight responsibilities, to include receiving briefings, tours, or other official information. That position remains unchanged, unquote. If we allow any agency, including the Postal Service, to stand, their policy to stand, despite the OSC opinion, members of Congress would be forbidden from providing basic on-site oversight of the Postal Service for 90 of the 730 days of an electoral term. That's more than 12% of our 2-year oversight responsibilities sacrificed because of a deliberate legal misinterpretation, and that's being charitable. The Ensuring Oversight Access to the Postal Service Act, H.R. 7674, is short and sweet. The bill clarifies the law and existing OSC guidance for the Postal Service. It states the United States Postal Service may not prevent or otherwise inhibit any member of Congress from accessing or visiting any Postal Service facility for official purposes, including accessing or visiting such a facility on or around the date of an election for federal office. As chairman of the Government Operations Subcommittee, I have a responsibility to oversee postal operations, which includes having access to postal facilities, managers, and employees. In the lead up to last year's elections, our constituents in every district demanded no less. This responsibility does not cease merely because an election is approaching. Oversight is a fundamental responsibility and duty of Congress. No agency, or in this case, no independent establishment of the executive branch, shall tell the first branch of government when and where they can conduct oversight. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Chairwoman Maloney and Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz, both of whom have supported these efforts and have also been victims of the Postal Service's misguided, incorrect, and wrong-headed policy to prevent congressional oversight. I think this is an important bill to reassert the rights of the first branch of government. The legislative branch is a separate but co-equal branch of government, and I urge its adoption. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. He yields back. I now recognize Mr. Comer, the distinguished ranking member of the committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm opposed to H.R. 7674. First, the Postal Service has raised important concerns about the bill. Letting members of Congress stroll through postal facilities on the eve of a federal election would create serious Hatch Act risks for their employees. In fact, the Postal Service detailed these concerns to this committee a couple of years ago. The Postal Service even offered to, at any time, schedule staff visits to postal facilities and to, at any time, provide members of Congress with briefings to address their questions and concerns properly. I've attended one of my postal mail handling facilities in Paducah, Kentucky, and they had absolutely no trouble touring that facility and getting a briefing from the high-level officials at the Postal Service. But this bill stems from the Democrats' bogus claims during the 2020 election season that Postmaster General DeJoy was trying to steal the election. A big lie. Members were trying to schedule visits within 45 days of the election or even showed up unannounced, adding unnecessary stress on staff trying to focus on ensuring the efficient processing of the mail. An interesting note, the Biden administration's new disinformation czar, Nina Yankowicz, pushed the Democrats' postal conspiracy theory. Maybe she's such a disinformation expert because she has peddled so much of it. Today's bill is unnecessarily and overly broad, and I plan to oppose it. Encourage members to oppose this bill. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition?
Chairman.
Mr. Norman, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Ms. Maloney. I, too, oppose this bill, and again, this is an unfunded mandate. I would like to enter into the record unanimous consent from Peter Pasteur, letter May 10th of this year. He's Vice President of Government Relations and Public Policy. In this letter, he states that this bill, if adopted as presently drafted, would significantly disrupt the Postal Service's current acquisition of the NGDV, the Next Generation Delivery Vehicles fleet, and consequently would endanger delivery to your constituents and entail significant
Without objection.
Financial cost and force other issues that we don't, that are not good for the Postal Service. Request unanimous consent. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? Well, I now recognize myself, and I'd like to thank my colleague, Mr. Conley, for introducing this important bill. Given the Postal Service role in delivering the mail, including the ballots of millions of Americans, it is critical that the Postal Service remain free from political influence. However, ensuring political neutrality does not excuse the Postal Service from congressional oversight. In recent years, the Postal Service has refused to allow members of Congress from both parties to perform in-person oversight at postal facilities within 45 days of an election. The Postal Service claims that this prohibition is the result of Hatch Act requirements. But the Hatch Act has no such prohibition for members of Congress. In fact, the Office of Special Counsel, the enforcement agency for the Hatch Act, has specifically stated that the Hatch Act does not prohibit members of Congress from touring facilities for an official purpose. Despite this, the Postal Service has continued to maintain its position that members of Congress are not entitled to visit facilities within 45 days of an election. If this position were to remain in place, it would have the effect of preventing official visits to Postal Service facilities for 3 months every other year. This is simply unacceptable. The Postal Service is not exempt from legitimate congressional oversight. This legislation makes it abundantly clear that the Postal Service may not deny members of Congress access to facilities for official purposes regardless of when an election may be scheduled. Members of Congress must be able to continue their work providing oversight of agencies, including the Postal Service, at all times. Again, I commend Representative Conley for introducing this legislation and urge all of my colleagues to support it on this side of the aisle. I now yield my remaining time to Mr. Conley.
I thank the Chair. I just wanted to insert into the record the letter from the U.S. Office of Special Counsel addressed to you and me dated October 13th, 2020, that I think makes it very clear that the Hatch Act does not apply to members of Congress, even if it's close to an election, who are undertaking their legitimate constitutional oversight responsibilities. Mr. Comer cites the Hatch Act, but the OSC opinion is quite different. And I think it should be part of this permanent record. Without a...
The gentleman yields back.
Not yet.
Without objection.
I thank the Chair. Just one other point. I'm sad that my friends on the other side of the aisle have framed this issue as a matter of, do we support Louis DeJoy as Postmaster General or do we not? This isn't about one Postmaster General. This is about the role of Congress. This is about asserting our rights as members of the legislative body with constitutional responsibilities in terms of oversight. It could be a different Postmaster General who prohibits you from going to a post office maybe close to an election. That's what we're trying to protect here. We're trying to protect your rights and ours. It's not a partisan issue. It's not about Louis DeJoy. It's a very straightforward bill. It could have been more complicated. There are other bills that are much more complicated that would put certain strictures on what the post office can and cannot do when a member of Congress visits that facility. I consciously did not include those to make this a very straightforward issue about access and the right of access. I urge my colleagues to consider those issues, and I continue to urge adoption of the reassertion of the right of members of Congress to do their jobs. I thank the Chair for yielding.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Representative Lawrence. Mr. Lynch is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to support Mr. Conley's bill. I'll remind the members that the decision that was objected to in the previous election was Postmaster General DeJoy's decision to remove the high-speed mail sorting machines in advance of an election that was using vote by mail. And obviously, there were real problems with that. There were attempts by members of Congress to exercise oversight responsibility. Members in this committee should be especially jealous of that power that Congress has been given to oversee federal agencies. So the way that the post office has interpreted this, they have given themselves a carve-out from congressional oversight. And I think that's a dangerous precedent. If they can do it, then every other agency can also do it. So look, Mr. DeJoy has redeemed himself, in my opinion, by his support for the postal reform bill. But we did have a distinct disagreement over that decision to remove the machines. And I think it was perfectly appropriate for members of Congress to make sure that the Postal Service was correctly handling the ballots and delivering the mail during that time period. So I think Mr. Conley's bill has appropriate and reasonable steps to allow Congress to exercise their oversight responsibility without interfering with the operation, the core operation of the Postal Service. So I hope my colleagues realize that, as he has said and as the chair has said, this is something that would help Democrats and Republican members of Congress at different times to make sure that the mails are being delivered and handled appropriately. And we should not have a carve-out for any federal agency that we, as co-equal branch of government have been given in the balance of power and the checks and balances that were articulated in our Constitution. So with that, Madam Chair, I just urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this bill. I thank Mr. Connolly for his thoughtful proposal, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 7674 as amended. All those in favor say aye. 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 All those opposed say no.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. A recorded vote has been requested. A recorded vote is so ordered. And pursuant to Clause 2 of Rule 11 and Committee Rule 5B, proceedings on the bill are postponed. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 6104, the Building of the Next Generation of Federal Employees Act. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 6104 to promote federal internships and fellowships to prepare the next generation of federal employees and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6104, offered by Ms. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as a base text for the purposes of amendment. I now recognize the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Conley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you for bringing up for consideration H.R. 6104, the Building the Next Generation of Federal Employees Act, or the Next Gen Feds. The federal workforce is at an inflection point. Only 6.9% of federal civilian employees are under the age of 30, compared to 23% in the private sector. Nearly a third, 29.4%, of the current federal workforce will be eligible for retirement within the next 3 years. Some experts have referred to this swell of eligibility as the retirement tsunami. In the federal government's mission-critical IT workforce, the data is even worse. About 19 times more federal employees in IT are above 50 in age than under 30, 52.3% to 2.8%, respectively. Nearly 30% of federal employees over the age of 55 at or nearing retirement age. The federal government must enhance and focus its recruitment and hiring policies to build the future federal workforce. We must attract and recruit the next generation of federal leaders to public service and champion policies that provide agencies the tools to acquire this talent. The workforce is the lifeblood of our federal government. Without people committed to public service, taxpayers, vulnerable populations, small businesses, and others will not be able to get the resources and services they need. If we fail to attract and hire the best to federal service, our nation, our communities, every one of our constituents suffers. Despite years of effort, strategic human capital management of the federal workforce remains on the Government Accountability's high-risk list. GAO notes that myriad items on their high-risk list are a result of the federal government's inability to close skill gaps and to hire, train, and staff up particularly critical federal staff. So if we untangle this Gordian knot, we have a key to unravel many of the other risks plaguing government. Some of those critical skills gaps in our federal workforce include the financial management of the Department of Defense's weapons systems acquisition workforce, the enforcement of federal tax laws, ensuring cybersecurity of our most sensitive information, effective vetting of our national security workforce, the purchasing of agile information technology to deliver federal services to the American public, and providing accessible and quality health care for our veterans. The federal government provides only 4,000 formal paid internships at any given time, and even those individuals struggle to move into federal service at the culmination of their internship. And that's what this bill is really aimed at. It's aimed at trying to facilitate the broadening of the internship program, systematizing it, and using it as an effective recruitment tool, none of which exists today. Meanwhile, the federal government's private sector competitors offered jobs to approximately 96% of their interns in the last 3 years. Nearly all who were made offers of employment accepted. The federal government knows neither how many interns it has nor how many of those are hired. It is estimated that we're in the single digits compared to 96% in the private sector in terms of internships who are offered and accept positions with the federal government. That is appalling. In a Harris poll published in 2019, the U.S. government's reputation ranked last in comparison to 100 top companies. Last. Simply put, individuals graduating from top schools are no longer attracted to federal service. We need to change that. Federal government must enhance and refocus its recruitment and hiring policies. The Subcommittee on Government Operations examined this imperative at a November hearing entitled The Future of Federal Work, which highlighted this issue. At that hearing, I announced the introduction of this bill, which promotes and leverages federal internships and fellowships to attract the talent of the future. This bill would do the following: establish a comprehensive federal internship and fellowship center within the OPM to administer, manage, and promote all federal internship and fellowship programs. Empower the Director of OPM to appoint an Executive Director to oversee that center. Authorize the Chief Human Capital Officers Council to provide strategic guidance to and facilitate interagency cooperation with that center. Require the appointment of internship coordinators to serve as the main point of contact for every sponsoring agency. To direct OPM to establish an online internship and fellowship platform, creating a one-stop shop for agencies to post and individuals to find internship opportunities. To authorize the OPM director to carry out a pilot program to attract individuals from underrepresented demographic populations to internship opportunities. To provide successful federal interns credit when applying to federal positions through the competitive hiring process. Require agencies to report annually to Congress on a variety of metrics related to the administration of the internship programs to evaluate their effectiveness. And the federal government has to streamline this process. I want to thank all the stakeholder organizations who worked with us on this bill, and that included the National Association of Active and Retired Federal Employees, and a number of federal employee organizations, including the National Federation of Federal Employees, the International Federation of Professional and Technical Engineers, Pay Our Interns, College to Congress, Professional Managers Association, and Demand Progress. I want to thank my co-sponsors, Representative Kilmer from Washington and Representative Kim from New Jersey, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman, the distinguished ranking member, is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am opposed to H.R. 6104. While this bill seeks to improve federal internship programs, it does not improve accountability of federal interns or the workforce. They will just now all be paid. To be clear, I do not have a problem with paying interns. I pay my interns. They provide valuable assistance to my office and constituents. And I will shortly offer an amendment that strikes the other provisions of this bill and simply says federal executive branch internships will now all be paid positions. But until and unless we make the federal workforce more attractive, talented young men and women are not going to forego other options to choose a job in the civil service. An important step would be to increase accountability for poor-performing federal workers, as Republicans have proposed and as President Trump attempted. But my Democrat colleagues have rejected such accountability improvements. I also have concerns about the impact of giving interns the same hiring preferences as veterans. How will this affect those who have served our country and their ability to gain federal employment? This bill tries to put a fresh coat of paint on the front door of federal agencies, so to speak, but ignores the mess inside. I urge my colleagues to oppose this legislation, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chair.
Mr. Norman is now recognized.
Thank you. I just want to emphasize what Congressman Comer said. You know, it's a standing joke in the private sector. How do you hold federal employees accountable? This does nothing to do that. It's a joke that if you ever want to fire somebody on the federal payroll, it's basically impossible. Same thing goes with underperforming teachers. They move them around from one school to the next, and we got such an opportunity to do some good things as President Trump tried to do to make it more accountable. So I just want to emphasize I'll be voting no on this, and I hope others will do the same. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chair.
Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to engage my friend and colleague, Mr. Connolly, on this, and I'll yield time to you, sir, to respond. Just with an honest question, my friend. In this great experiment, 240 years into it now, government of the people, by the people, and for the people, relationships are established within the offices of our elected officials. You have relationships with your constituents and their families, as do I, and we cherish and honor those relationships. We attempt to be worthy of the positions that we hold, and we hope that history remembers us fondly as a true servant of the American people and this beautiful nation that we love and serve. So why would you, my colleague and my friend who I greatly respect, why would you want to restrict the relationship between an elected official? I realize you're talking about the executive branch here, but why would you want to restrict an office from allowing an unpaid volunteer to come in when it's codified in law that you strictly have a paid position within an office? You introduce the very rigid parameters of a job description, and you eliminate the flexibility of that office to have the ability to allow a young American to come into the office and earn some work experience and participate in the system that belongs to them. So why would we restrict that? And I yield to my friend whom I respect.
You know, I think, my friend, and I guess it's a fair question, but I guess the answer is experience. Experience, and let's look at the private sector, which I know my friends on the other side of the aisle revere. Well, in the private sector, internships are competitive. They go through often a very rigorous process to be selected, and they're paid. They're paid. And as a result, they can then use this very effectively to recruit talented employees for the future. That's all I'm trying to do with this bill. I'm trying to professionalize our approach to internships so that instead of 6 or 7% of federal interns ultimately becoming federal employees, we begin to approach the private sector 96%. And the reason it's important, Mr. Higgins, then I'll be quiet, is because of this tsunami we're facing of potential retirements. A third of the federal workforce in the next 3 years. And that's hundreds of thousands of people. We're only talking about 4,000 federal interns right now. So most of whom will not become federal employees, I might add. So this is one tool, one tool. It's not an exclusive tool. It's not the full solution. But if we can professionalize this, it gives us a leg up in trying to begin to plug that hole we know is coming. I thank my friend for yielding.
I thank my colleague for responding. I respectfully oppose the legislation. I just feel that it's an unnecessary restriction of access by we the people to the offices of their own government through a willing and cultivated relationship with the head of that office. And I would hate to have to tell a constituent, I'm sorry, I cannot allow your young American family, son or daughter, to come and participate in their own office's operations for a couple of weeks because Congress has codified into law that it has to be a paid position with strict job description guidelines. But I do respect the gentleman's response, and I yield the balance of my time to my colleague, Mr. Norman.
Thank you, Congressman Higgs. Congressman Connolly, let me give you a real live example of, you say all interns are paid. I run a real estate development company. Had a young lady who wanted to come with the company. I said, I can't afford you. She said, well, due to what you could teach me, I'll work free. And if I'm justifiable at a time, then you can pay me. That's a real live example. I would argue the opposite, that by requiring interns to be paid, I realize it's with OPM, other people's money, but that's a real live example of where we just said we couldn't do it. You don't know enough. I don't know your desire level. All the ingredients that go to make somebody successful, I didn't know until they had them on our had them in our office. She gladly did that, and now is one of our highest paid employees, but it's only after a time that she learned it and figured out that's what she wanted to do. It looks like you have a question. I'll yield to you.
I would need the chair's permission since time has expired.
My time has expired, Madam Chair.
Okay, I recognize myself and yield to Mr. Connolly.
I thank my friend. Well, first of all, I think Mr. Comer's got an amendment that would, in fact, pay all of the federal interns. So you and Mr. Higgins might find yourself on the other side of Mr. Comer's amendment. But let me just say, I'm glad for your experience. But let me tell you, I've got people who, because we now do pay interns, are able to have the experience in the Hill they otherwise could not afford, because they don't come from the kind of background that allows them the luxury of volunteering. And by paying interns, we broaden the talent pool and we broaden the opportunity, especially for those from disadvantaged backgrounds. And so equity becomes an issue here, Mr. Norman, and you and I both need to be sensitive to that, and I know you are, and so am I. And so that's why I think that's an important change that actually provides not only more diversity, but actually a broader talent pool. I thank the chair for yielding.
Reclaiming my time, I support this bill, which will create a pathway for individuals who complete internships and fellowships in federal agencies to receive credit for that experience in applying for federal employment. This is truly a win-win for everyone. It expands opportunity to more people to pursue a career in government and allows agencies to more effectively hire people early in their careers who already have relevant work experience. H.R. 6104 makes the process of exploring and applying for federal and government internships more accessible by establishing a central federal internship and fellowship center in the Office of Personnel Management, or OPM. The center would manage a publicly accessible website where interested individuals can search and apply for federal government internships. By creating more transparency in the process, more people will be encouraged to apply for federal internships. This one-stop shop would better serve potential internship applicants and the agency hiring managers. The new center would also provide guidance to agencies in designing an internship program that employs best practices to recruit and hire top talent and make the internship experience an engaging one for participants. Every 2 years, agencies will submit a formal plan for internship administration for review and certification by the head of the center. These plans will include details on how agencies recruit interns and their partnership with external internship programs. Internship coordinators at each agency will be able to collaborate with the center to make improvements to their programs. OPM will be required to provide an annual report to Congress on the operation and impact of internship programs government-wide. The Biden administration has stated its intention to increase the number of paid internships in the federal government. This bill will help achieve that goal by mandating that federal internships and fellowships be paid. No one should be discouraged from applying for an internship with the federal government because they cannot afford it. We can open up these meaningful work opportunities to a broader talent pool and make progress toward building a more diverse federal workforce. As part of a pilot program, those who successfully complete a federal internship will get credit applied to their competitive service evaluation. This is an important incentive to attract former federal government interns who already have training and experience with federal agency work to pursue a career in public service. An internship should be a stepping stone to employment, and this bill streamlines the process for the federal government to hire more interns. These improvements to the early career pipeline will help address an issue we have talked about many times on this committee, an aging federal workforce. About 30% of today's federal workers will be eligible for retirement in the next 5 years. Sustaining a strong federal workforce that can attract top talent is crucial to ensuring that federal agencies can carry out their mission and consistently serve the American people. The A&S that we are considering today provides sensible accountability and reporting measures that will make federal internship programs more accessible and empower agencies to administer them more effectively. It removes barriers so that the interns who complete the programs will be well positioned to advance careers as federal employees. I want to thank Mr. Conley for his work on this bill and his steadfast support for reforms that support the federal workforce and strengthen it for the future. I invite my colleagues to join me in supporting this important bill, and I yield back. Who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment to ask when it's appropriate.
Okay, Mr. Heiss, okay.
I'd like to speak to
the clerk will report.
I'd like to speak to the original at some point.
Pardon me?
When it's appropriate, I'd like to speak to the original bill.
Okay, we will go to you first, if that's all right with you, Mr. Heiss, so that he can speak on the original bill. You are now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd just like to, for a second, step back and think about first principles in the sense that the bureaucracy exists to serve the people of our nation, and not the people exist to support the bureaucracy. And I bring that up just because I think it's important we don't lose sight of that as we weigh the functions of our bureaucracy. And at the moment, we have a bureaucracy that's heavily bloated, it's extremely inefficient, its customer service is renownedly poor. For the last couple of years, much of the federal workforce has been, quote, teleworking, many of them not working. We still have veterans who don't get care, farmers who can't get access to their FSA office, passport backlogs. We have vax mandates that led to early retirements, which were unconstitutional. We can look at bringing workforce back. You know, there's a number of these issues that it seems like we should be addressing these sort of things. We need accountability in the bureaucracy. We need to have a bureaucracy that's responsive to us, to the people that they are hired to serve. Right now, the bureaucracy has become a fourth branch of government that has more heft than Congress, and oftentimes more heft than the White House. And we've sat in committee hearing after committee hearing, often talking to bureaucrats whose attitude is basically they'll drag their feet and implement the policy they want. Currently, we have a number of agencies that continually break the law on a daily basis and are not held accountable. And the idea that we're not addressing those issues, while an intern program may be a great idea, we're bringing interns now into a bureaucracy that is completely bloated, inefficient, is breaking the law on a daily basis, and it just seems like we should get back to the first principles of fixing the bureaucracy before we're looking to create a more bloated bureaucracy which the people are left to support. The average private sector employee makes far less and has less benefits than someone in the bureaucracy doing the same sort of work already. And so our priority in serving in Congress should always be to support the people who elected us while providing a limited functioning government to ensure the rights and securities provided for designated in the Constitution. So I just think it's important that we do that with this context, and so I have some serious concerns about the approach of this bill, and thank you for that, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, although the chair will observe this concern about bureaucracies being a fourth level of government didn't seem to apply in our previous conversation about access to postal facilities. But I guess consistency is a challenge for all of us. Who seeks recognition? Mr. Heiss?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I did not speak to the last bill, so I would ask that you not insinuate something on my behalf that I have not said. You're alleging an inconsistency
I wasn't
for me.
necessarily applying to you. I was simply
you were painting with a broad brush.
Yes.
But in response to my statements. So if you have an issue with my statements, then great, but don't say that I'm being inconsistent.
I didn't say you were inconsistent. I said the sentiments were inconsistent with the previous conversation. Mr. Heiss, you're recognized for an amendment.
Yes, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6104, offered by Mr. Heiss of Georgia.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 6104 is called the Building the Next Generation of Federal Employees Act. But quite frankly, under this bill, the next generation of federal employees is going to look exactly like the current, which is not a pretty picture. And the problem, quite frankly, is not in the recruitment side of things. The problem is in the federal workforce itself. That's because unless we deal with the broader issue around the federal workplace, then this bill of trying to recruit new workers is simply not going to attract the caliber of people that the bill intends to attract. The numbers show the true story, particularly as it relates to federal internships. Only 4,000 paid internships in 2020, down from 60,000 in 2010. New hires from internships are down from 35,000 in 2010 to 4,000 in 2018. This is not working for either side of the equation, whether we're talking the interns or the federal workforce itself. But we are absolutely kidding ourselves if we think that making changes to the internship program is going to improve the quality of the federal workforce. It just simply is not going to happen. Only 8% of the federal workforce currently is under the age of 30. 73% of the workers who are under the age of 30 left civil service in under 2 years. That clearly is indicative of the fact that they did not have a good work experience in the federal workplace. Therein lies the problem. Not recruiting new interns, but the problems why we don't even keep the interns that we have. 73% of them quit in less than 2 years. We have a problem that simply is not attracting people to the federal workforce. And we cannot ignore the fact that the federal workplace bears the reputation of a bureaucracy, as has been referred to several times this morning, and it does not deal with poor performers. On the most recent Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey, only 42% of federal employees who answered the survey said steps are taken to deal with poor performers. Now notice the question did not even ask if steps are taken to get rid of poor performers, but are there even steps to deal with poor performers? The fact is only 9% said poor performers either left the workplace or were removed. That reinforces the negative reputation that I mentioned. It also points to a workplace where good workers therefore must pick up the slack for poor performers and live with the poor morale that is created from the malcontents or those who shriek from their responsibilities. So I've introduced legislation, the Accountable Feds Act, which takes real steps to improve the federal workplace, which is the problem. I'm offering that text as an amendment to H.R. 6104. My amendment makes sure federal managers can deal with poor performers in an appropriate and timely manner. It reinstates, for example, Schedule F, a new civil service category for feds in policy-related roles. It ensures that these employees give their best effort to implement the agenda of the president, the elected leader of the people, rather than decide for themselves what they believe is best for the country. This bill also makes sure that feds spend their time doing the job that they were hired to do rather than on union activities, and it ensures union agreements are negotiated with the needs and interests of the taxpayers first and foremost. Look, I understand the need to recruit talented individuals, and I am not opposed to that. We need good, talented people in federal jobs. But I also understand the needs of the American people through an accountable civil service. That should be our primary focus today. And this is not an either-or situation. I think we've got to look at rewarding good work and effectively handling poor performers. Both of these are critical. Demanding employees actually do their jobs rather than union jobs, this is common sense. And I just believe, Mr. Chairman, if this committee is serious about civil service reform, then we need to do more than simply modify the internship program, and that's why that's what my amendment will do, and I encourage adoption of it. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I would insert in the record OPM data that would show that in the last 2 fiscal years, 88,643 federal employees were terminated or removed for cause. It's not true that there's no accountability. And I would ask unanimous consent that that be entered into the record without objection.
I now myself.
Thank you, Jim.
In opposition to this amendment offered by my good friend, Representative Heiss. The intention of the bill is to open up the opportunity of federal employment to more people, particularly to the interns that successfully complete certified internships with the federal government. The amendment would do the opposite by resurrecting the attacks on the federal workers from the Trump administration that undermine the civil service merit system, opening them up to political retaliation. One of the policies that would be brought back with this amendment is the Trump executive order establishing Schedule F, which was an egregious attempt to make it easier to fire federal workers in violation of civil service protections. This and the other anti-union provisions included here were blatant attacks on the federal workforce that President Biden immediately revoked when he took office. I strongly object to the policies that this amendment seeks to codify that would make the federal workforce significantly weaker. We are still repairing the damage done by the Trump administration through these misguided policies, and this amendment would bring us backward, not forward. I oppose this amendment and encourage my colleagues to vote no. Who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chair.
Mr. Norman, you're now recognized.
Madam Chair, I rise in support of this amendment by Congressman Heiss. You know, we've got to remember this is a tremendous problem, particularly with what we've experienced in the last 2 years with COVID. Many governmental offices are still closed. Representative Heiss, with the interns, in many cases at this stage would come to work with empty buildings. Many people are still working at home. Case in point, we just hired a young lady who had been with Social Security for 20 years. They're still not open in my area. The building is closed. She quit, her conscience got to her because of the people in the parking lot that were asking her questions about Social Security that she couldn't answer because their files were in the office, and she couldn't interview them to provide a service. She's now with us at half the pay. That's just one example of how dysfunctional it is now, particularly with so many offices closed and people working from home. So I support your amendment, Congressman Heiss. I think it's common sense, and it makes sense in so many different levels, and particularly at this stage in what's soon to be, I assume, another COVID pandemic that will be upon us around election time. So, Congressman Heiss, I would yield the balance of my time to you.
I thank my friend from South Carolina. Look, it's simply not true, and nor is it accurate to blame President Trump on harming the federal workforce. The federal workforce was a disaster when he became president, and in fact, while he was implementing policies that dealt with poor performers, the federal workforce, according to surveys at the time, they were happier, they were more satisfied, they felt more productive because poor performers were no longer given a free ride. I can't understand why my colleagues on the other side of the aisle do not want to address the problems within the federal workforce and instead want to put Band-Aids by saying, oh, what we need to do is come up with an internship program and hire interns, require all this type of stuff, putting Band-Aids, thinking, oh, this is going to fix the federal workforce, when the problem is deeply inset within the workforce itself. There is no company in the country that could survive poor performers and it taking up to 2 years to get rid of poor performers like it does here in the federal civil service. It takes forever to deal with poor performers, and that is precisely why 73% of those who are working in federal workforce who are under 30 years of age, 73% of them quit within 2 years. It is a miserable environment. It is an environment where the good workers have to not only do their job, but they have to do the job of others who refuse to work, not to mention the toxic environment of low morale that is created by those who don't want to work. Therein is the problem that we need to focus. And to think that we can stick a Band-Aid on such a horrible bleed that we have right now, I believe is very naive. And although, again, I'm totally in favor of recruiting the best that we can get, but we must look at the real nature of the problem. And with that, I'll yield back to the gentleman from South Carolina. Thank you for yielding.
Again, thank you, Congressman Heiss. I think it makes good sense. The modus operandi of the left now is to blame President Trump for everything, including he helped the system for putting accountability in. You're right, it's toxic when you have employees that weigh the good employees down, and one of the reasons that they're, whether it's in the private sector or the government, that they're leaving. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The question now occurs on the amendment from Mr. Heiss.
Madam Chairwoman?
Oh, Mr. Comer?
No, Mr. Connolly. Oh, does Mr. Comer seek recognition?
Yes, Mr.
Sorry,
Comer seeking.
I yield. But I would also seek recognition after Mr. Comer.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to say I strongly support Mr. Heiss's amendment, and I have to say this. Jody Heiss has spent his entire time in Congress fighting to ensure the accountability of the federal workforce and make federal government a more attractive place to work. And I appreciate his work on the Government Operations Subcommittee and his entire time in Congress trying to make this a better work environment and try to make it the workforce more accountable to the American taxpayers. So strongly support this amendment, encourage everyone to vote in favor of the House amendment. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Conley is now recognized.
I thank the chair. I strongly oppose this amendment, and I don't agree with Mr. Comer. I think what we've just heard is yet another screed against public employees. They're bureaucrats, not public servants. They can't be removed for cause, even though, in fact, the data would suggest otherwise. They're bloated. They're overpaid. They don't work. These kinds of stereotypes about our public employees are one of the reasons why we have the crisis that Mr. High cites in public employment. It's one of the reasons why public employment is less attractive to this generation than previous generations, because members of Congress denigrate the public servants who make government work, who during the pandemic, risked themselves to make sure that the public was served. Have we no respect for the men and women who do serve our constituents, whether it be fighting fires in the West or making sure a Social Security check gets unraveled and paid in the right way, or a veteran gets the medical care he or she is entitled to? Internships are designed to try to fix one part of the problem. Denigrating the public workforce is not the way to do it. I urge my colleagues to defeat this amendment and support the underlying bill. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Groffman, you are now recognized.
Can I yield a bit of time to Congressman Heiss?
I thank the gentleman, and I would just respond, Mr. Connolly, you know we've worked together on a lot of these things, but my issue, and I greatly resent being accused of denigrating federal workers. My comments were directed to poor performers within the federal workforce, and there is an enormous difference. And to try to throw a blanket over my statements of denigrating all federal workers is irresponsible and absolutely inaccurate, and I believe you know that. I have great respect for federal workers, but I have a serious problem, and I'm sure your constituents, you hear from them as much as I do from mine, when they call federal agencies and they can't even get anyone to answer the phone. They can't get answers. They get one answer from this individual, they get another answer from a different individual. It's all over the map. They never hear back oftentimes. And what is this coming from? It's not coming from good federal workers, which we have a lot of them, and we're grateful for them. But these type of problems that you hear from your constituents and I hear from mine are coming from poor performers within the federal workforce, and those are the individuals that we need to hear from. And it's that type of worker that creates a toxic environment within the federal workforce that, frankly, is running off younger workers, the ones that you, rightfully so, are trying to attract to the federal workforce, which we all support. Let's attract them. But part of attracting a new generation of federal workers involves creating an environment that is a healthy environment for those individuals who are working. And it is those poor performers that we need action and accountability that right now is grossly lacking. And I just want to correct the record that my comments are not in any way directed towards the majority of federal workers who are doing a great job, but my comments are purposefully directed to those poor performers who drag the entire system down and who need to be dealt with accountability. And with that, I'll yield back to Mr. Grothman.
Remainder of time, back to you.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? The question now occurs on the amendment.
Madam Chair.
Offered. Mr. Clyde. Mr. Clyde is now recognized. Mr. Clyde.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. I strongly support this amendment. I think what Mr. Heiss has been working on for the last number of years is summed up in this amendment, and I think it's a very valuable amendment. You know, since it takes up to 2 years to remove federal employees, those that are not good performers, you know, it's only been 1 year and 4 months since the Biden administration has taken over. It would only be reasonable to believe that many of these removals that were mentioned, the 88,000 that were removed for cause, were begun under the Trump administration, you know, not during the Biden administration. Accountability is paramount to a federal workforce. Customer service is paramount to a federal workforce. This is an outstanding amendment and should be supported by every member on this committee. And I encourage all of them to vote for it, because I think it would make a very positive difference in the way the federal government responds to the people. And remember, we work for the people. The federal government is to work for the people and not the other way around. And with that, if Mr. Heiss would like any more time, I would certainly yield to him.
I thank the gentleman, but I'm good.
All right, then I yield.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? The question now occurs on the Heiss Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not adopted. A recorded vote has been requested. A recorded vote is so ordered and pursuant to Clause 2 of Rule 11 and Committee Rule 5B. Proceedings on the amendment are postponed. Is there further amendments or discussion? Mr. Comer, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6104, offered by Mr. Comer of Kentucky.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As I said earlier, I do not have a problem with paying interns. Yes, they're learning on the job, gaining experience and insight, but that's true of any job. I pay my interns, both in my personal office and those on the committee. I think they should be compensated for the service they provide my constituents or the committee. To me, it's an issue of fairness. It also makes internship opportunities an option for those who can't afford to work for free. I expressed my concerns with the larger bill in my opening statement, that without addressing important civil service reforms to add accountability, as Mr. Heiss has just discussed, federal employment is not going to be a top choice for more young workers. So my amendment strikes the provisions of the underlying bill except for those requiring interns to be paid. I look forward to a time when we can consider comprehensive civil service reforms that reflect concerns Republicans have raised and the needs of the American people. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
Who seeks recognition?
Madam Chair.
Mr. Conley, you're now recognized.
Madam Chair, I find it interesting that there seems to be a disagreement about whether we should require the payment of interns on the other side of the aisle, but that notwithstanding, essentially what Mr. Comer is doing is making perfect be the enemy of the good. So unless we have comprehensive civil service reform that addresses all of the concerns my friends on the other side of the aisle have raised about removal because of bad performance, lack of responsiveness, an overbloated bureaucracy, et cetera, that this is a Band-Aid and should not proceed. I beg to differ. This is a meaningful reform that will strike a blow in one part of the federal government that would facilitate the next generation coming into federal service. We need that. This bill will help do that. It is an improvement, and we should not make perfect be the enemy of the good in insisting that absent comprehensive civil service reform that addresses all of our concerns, real and imagined, we should not do anything. And I simply don't accept that proposition, and I urge defeat of this amendment.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chair.
Mr. Higgins, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want my colleague, Mr. Connolly, to know that we're gonna find that C-SPAN where you read off everything that's wrong with the bill, and we're going to use just that part, Mr. Connolly. So, in the interest of our ongoing struggle to try and all of us do the right thing, let me just say that there's obvious disagreement across the aisles regarding just how much legislation should be introduced to further restrict our federal offices from freely engaging with the citizens that we serve, including through internships. I think it's unnecessarily restrictive. I appreciate the spirit of Mr. Comer's amendment, but I look forward to more complete efforts around civil service reform. And I think today's introduced legislation has spurred interesting debate. Madam Chair, I yield.
Would the gentleman yield?
I do, to my friend.
I thank the gentleman. And just real quickly, I would say I reject the notion as well, Mr. Connolly, that the solution always is to spend more taxpayer dollars, and somehow that the taxpayers always end up bearing the burden of what the Democrats believe is a solution to every problem. Let's throw more money at it. And throwing more money at a problem, in this case forcing by law the hiring of interns, is not going to fix the problems within the federal workforce. And so I would just, I thank the gentleman for yielding, but I would just note I support Mr. Comer's amendment, and I reject the idea that the solution, the enemy of the perfect being the enemy of the good, I reject the idea that the good involves always forcing taxpayers to pay more money. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Who else?
Would my friend yield for a question?
Madam Chair, if I'm still recognized, I yield to my friend, Mr.
I thank my friend. My question just is, Mr. Heiss just said he supports the amendment, and the amendment
My mistake.
Okay, thank you. I thank my friend. I thank Mr. Higgins for yielding.
Madam Chair, I yield.
Okay. Mr. Cloud.
I have one quick statement then. You know, anytime we spend money, we should recognize that we are putting a burden on the American people. And right now, the federal bureaucracy has plenty of resources. We have a report that comes out from the GAO that talks about waste, fraud, and abuse. We have one hearing on it, and summarily, we follow no of the recommendations to reform our government. I'm not against interns being paid, but we've got to first keep in mind the people of this nation, and they're already under a great weight of inflation and everything that's going on in the economy, broken supply chains, and just poor leadership right now. We've got to put that first before in creating a larger bureaucracy. So with that, I'd like to yield the remaining of my time to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Cloud, for yielding. I have to respond to what Mr. Connolly said. You mischaracterized my amendment, Mr. Connolly. When you came to me a month ago talking about this bill, it was a bill to pay interns. I support paying interns. Not everybody supports paying interns, but I support paying interns. In Biden's America with Biden inflation, I mean, I have sympathy for these interns trying to work in Washington, D.C., a very expensive city. My amendment simply avoids creating a new bureaucracy and pays interns. So I just wanted to set the record straight. And again, I encourage support of my amendment. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? I now recognize myself to speak on the amendment.
I'll yield the gentleman time.
Pardon me? You're yielding, you are recognized, you wish to be recognized to yield time to Mr. Connolly. You're so recognized.
I thank you. I appreciate what Mr. Comer just said. It is true, I did approach him on this bill months ago. It's also true that I only learned he had an amendment this morning. And if we're going to have collaboration and cooperation and mutual respect, it seems to me that, especially on a serious legislative effort, where there was a legitimate and genuine effort to solicit input and seek collaboration, we might give each other a little more respect with respect to amendments that would gut a bill that we discussed months ago. I thank my friend for yielding.
Time is yours, Ms. Norton.
I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. I recognize myself to speak on the amendment. While I am encouraged that there is bipartisan agreement that federal government interns should be paid, I do not support the amendment from the ranking member. The rest of the bill, establishing a process to more efficiently hire interns who successfully complete federal internships, goes hand in hand with the requirement that they be paid. The bill puts in place a comprehensive approach to making the internship programs more engaging, successful, and accessible. I urge my colleagues to reject that amendment. The question now occurs on the amendment. The question now occurs on the amendment offered by Mr. Comer. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not adopted. Okay, all right. Pursuant to notice, wait a minute, we now have to vote.
Nope, we can't because we've got an amendment pending.
Okay, pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 7686, the District of Columbia Code Returning Citizens Coordination Act. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 7686, to direct the Director of the Bureau of Prisons to provide information on certain persons under the jurisdiction of the Bureau of Prisons to the Mayor of the District of Columbia and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment. At any point, the chair recognizes Mrs. Norton to offer an amendment in the nature. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7686, offered by Ms. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for purposes of an amendment. I now recognize the sponsor of the bill, the gentle lady, Representative Norton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney, for marking up this bill. This bill will require the Federal Bureau of Prisons to provide information to the District of Columbia government on individuals convicted of felonies under D.C. law in BOP custody. Currently, BOP provides no information to the district on these individuals, even immediately before release, which inhibits reentry, increases recidivism, and harms public safety. Federal law requires BOP to incarcerate individuals convicted of felonies under D.C. law. There are currently 3,200 such individuals in BOP custody, and they are located in prisons throughout the United States. This unique custody arrangement creates several obstacles to successful reentry, including information sharing among agencies. BOP asserts that federal privacy laws prohibit it from providing any information to D.C. on these individuals, which prevents D.C. from having services ready for them when they return from prison. Yet studies consistently show the importance of health care, housing, education, job training, and substance use disorder treatment for successful reentry. This bill would require the Bureau of Prisons to provide D.C. 2 types of information on each individual convicted of a D.C. Code felony in BOP custody. Every 90 days, BOP would provide the name, age, federal register number, facility where housed, and the scheduled release date. Upon DC's request, BOP would provide DC the same information that BOP provides to the Court Services and Offender Supervision Agency for the District of Columbia on these individuals, such as their release plan, CSOSA is a federal agency that supervises individuals convicted of DC felonies on supervised release and parole. DC would be allowed to provide the biographical information only to counsel for the individuals and to organizations that provide legal representation to individuals in criminal or post-conviction matters, or in matters related to reentry. DC would not be allowed to provide any other information, and DC law enforcement agencies would not have access to that information. The overwhelming majority of people in prison return home. I hope everyone agrees on the importance of successful reentry. I urge support for this bill, Madam Chair.
I now recognize the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Comer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The goal of H.R. 7686 is to ensure that individuals returning from the Bureau of Prisons custody to D.C. after serving time for felonies receive adequate supervision and services. Well, I have good news for my colleagues. This is already happening. The Bureau of Prisons already shares information on returning citizens being released back into the district with the Federal Court Services and Offender Supervision Agency for the District of Columbia, also known as CSOA. CSOA is the federal agency that supervises D.C. Code felons coming out of Bureau of Prisons custody. Created in 1997, CSOA's strategic goals literally include integrating offenders into the community by connecting them with resources and interventions. Therefore, federal taxpayer dollars already support an agency whose mission is to adequately supervise and connect recently released Bureau of Prisons offenders with the D.C. community services they need. I see no reason for the mayor's office to duplicate CSOA's mission when more resources are needed to address the local D.C. crime wave. I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? I yield.
I seek recognition,
I recognize myself and yield to the distinguished lady.
I can speak after you do, Madam Chair.
Okay. Well, then I recognize myself. I'd like to thank the distinguished gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, for introducing this important legislation. The vast majority of individuals who are in prison will return home. It is our responsibility to help ensure that their reentry is as smooth and successful as possible. The research is clear. Healthcare, housing, education, preparation for employment, and other services help smooth an individual's transition. Due to existing federal law, district residents who are convicted of felonies are currently incarcerated by the Federal Bureau of Prisons. As a result, they are incarcerated at various facilities around the country, and limited information is provided to district officials about these individuals. This straightforward bill would require the Bureau of Prisons to provide updates of simple demographic data, such as the name, location, and release date of incarcerated individuals to district officials every 90 days. This basic information will help the district ease reentry by ensuring that district agencies have the information they need to support returning citizens. I urge passage of this important legislation, and I yield to my colleague, Ms. Norton.
I thank the gentlewoman for yielding. I think there's some confusion on what CSOSA, Court Services and Supervision Agency, does. CSOSA is a supervising agency. It is not a social services agency. It cannot solve, it cannot share information. CSOSA cannot share information with CSOSA. With DC. CSOSA at this time cannot share information with the District of Columbia.
The gentlelady yields back.
I yield back, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair.
Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Heiss, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Straight from CSOSA's website, it says that the strategic goals within the context of what we're talking about here include, quote, integrating offenders into the community by connecting them with resources and interventions, as well as to reducing recidivism by targeting criminogenic risk and needs using innovative and evidence-based strategies. So, I mean, this is a duplicative process. The DC mayor does not need to be involved in this process. It's already happening. It's already taking place. And I would just agree with the ranking member. The mayor's office should focus on trying to get the enormous crime wave under control that's in this city, rather than taking on additional social services that are already being performed by CSOSA and funded, by the way, by taxpayers. This bill is duplicative, and it simply does not need to shift responsibility to the mayor's office. And furthermore, quite frankly, I lack confidence in the mayor's office to perform yet another role when they are already failing on curtailing the crime wave that's happening in D.C., violence, homelessness, business shutdowns, et cetera, all over the city. And so for this reason, I oppose this bill, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chair.
You've already been recognized. Does another Democrat want to be recognized to yield time to Ms. Norton? Mr. Davis, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And, you know, I've listened to the discussion, not really intending to speak, but I don't know how one could expect the kind of reentry services that are available and have been put together if they don't have all of the information that they need to have to plan, develop programs, know how many individuals they have who are affected. And so I strongly support this bill and yield the rest of my time to Representative Norton.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. I'd like to further clarify. It is the District of Columbia that provides the social services. Our problem is that CSOSA cannot share the information with the District of Columbia. I yield back.
The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Ms. Norton. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 7686 as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. H.R. 7686 shall be favorably reported to the House. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the matters considered by the committee in this markup. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 7682, the Ensuring an Accurate Postal Fleet Electrification Act. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 7682 to require the United States Postal Service to conduct a new environmental impact statement with respect to procuring next-generation delivery vehicles and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment. At any point, the chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7682, offered by Ms. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as a base text for purposes of amendment. I now recognize myself. The Postal Service operates a fleet of roughly 230,000 vehicles. That's roughly 1/3 of the entire federal fleet. Unfortunately, this fleet is rapidly aging, with many vehicles already more than 3 decades old. These old postal trucks are often unsafe, with high maintenance costs, and get terrible gas mileage at a time we cannot afford to continue polluting our environment. Last year, the Postal Service signed a 10-year contract to order up 165,000 vehicles. Unfortunately, the Postal Service has stated that only 10% of the vehicles it purchases under the contract will be electronic, while the remaining 90%, up to 148,000 vehicles, will be the old gas guzzlers. This is simply unacceptable. Doubly concerning is the fact that the Postal Service determined that this 90-10 split of ICE vehicles to EVs based upon a faulty environmental impact statement, more commonly referred to as the Environmental Impact Statement, EIS. The EIS filed by the Postal Service does not accurately reflect the cost savings and environmental benefits of EVs. In fact, the Nonpartisan Government Accountability Office testified at our hearing only a few weeks ago that the Postal Service used faulty estimates to determine how many EVs to purchase, electronic vehicles to purchase. Among other areas, the Postal Service assumed that the price of gas would only reach $2.36 per gallon by 2030. Even though the current national average price is over $4 per gas now, and in California it's as high as $8 per gallon. GAO also found that the Postal Service assumed the cost of maintenance for an electronic vehicle would be more than that of the regular vehicle. Despite research GAO identified indicates the exact opposite is true, that it is much cheaper to maintain an electronic vehicle. Some people have testified that they don't do anything for years to do any type of maintenance on electronic vehicles. The Postal Service's EIS also failed to account for the full environmental impacts of purchasing so many gas-guzzling fossil fuel vehicles instead of environmental-friendly electronic vehicles. Given GAO's findings and the apparent failings of the EIS, this bill would require the Postal Service to perform a new environmental impact statement to ensure that it fully takes into account the benefits and impacts of various vehicle types. We are in the middle of a climate crisis. The Postal Service should be leading the charge to reduce carbon emissions and green its fleet. Locking itself into gas-guzzling trucks for at least another 2 decades is bad for the environment, bad for our health, and bad for business. I urge my colleagues to support this common sense bill, and I yield back. Mr. Comer, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Not only am I opposed to this bill, I'm honestly pretty upset about this bill. We worked together in a sincere, bipartisan way and passed one of the few major bipartisan bills that I think will pass Congress this year and become law. And our goal, our worthy goal, was to reform the Postal Service, to stop the hemorrhaging of cash and improve the performance of mail delivery. That's the role of the post office. The post office should be self-sustainable, and it should be able to deliver the mail in a timely manner. This bill is not interested in supporting the Postal Service's mission to deliver mail effectively and efficiently. It's not interested in making sure that the current Postal Service employees have safe delivery trucks. It's not interested in wisely investing taxpayer dollars. It's more interested in catering to the far left and its radical climate change agenda. This bill stops the Postal Service from getting its much-needed and overdue delivery vehicles, and it demands another environmental impact study, even though the Postal Service just released a 340-page one last December. This is a partisan bill that recklessly delays the Postal Service's new delivery vehicles. I strongly oppose this bill, and I encourage my colleagues to also oppose. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chair.
Mr. Norman, you're now recognized.
First of all, I agree with Representative Comer. This is really an insult, to be honest with you. As my good friend Clay Higgins said, this is just to get an EI, the left is trying to get an EIS, I guess another 350-page document that they agree with. What this is doing is preventing a company who has bid this fair and square from producing the vehicles. If you're talking about disrupting the Postal Service, this bill does it. And I would like to unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from Peter Pastura on May 10th of 22, which basically outlines the issues that I will go over, and I will have an amendment that addresses this.
Without objection.
And Madam Chair, this is the kind of thing that we spend time on in the past, working on, and thought we had something to agree on by bipartisanship, and then you had a company that bid this, and I just, it's wrong for the company, it's wrong for the Postal Service, it's wrong for the American people that are getting the mail to stop this just because a far-left group, which is running this, the Democratic Party, from getting involved at this level. So I'll oppose this, and we'll have my amendment at the proper time. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? Mr. Cloud, you're now recognized.
Thank you. Yeah, this bill, it's kind of odd that we're talking about this just after recently passing out of this committee, the Postal Service bill. But once again, we're seeing in this bill, this administration and those who support them in this Congress forcing an artificial, dramatic transition to electric vehicles. The Postal Service contract with Oshkosh is one example of that. Another example lies in President Biden's goal of having half of all new cars sold in the U.S. be electric before 2030. This administration needs to approach electric vehicles carefully. A typical electric car requires 6 times the mineral inputs of conventional cars, according to the International Energy Agency. The U.S. is dependent on other countries for minerals used in the production of electric vehicles. Minerals like lithium, nickel, cobalt are critical for battery performance. Compared to other countries, the U.S. production of these minerals is negligible. Rare earth elements are used for permanent magnets that are in electric vehicle motors. and currently China has a monopoly over the mining of rare earth minerals. The U.S., we are 100% reliant on rare earth minerals, and China controls 90% of the market. The increased production and procurement of electric vehicles will cause the demand for minerals to increase, making America more dependent on countries like China for the everyday needs. This will also increase the cost of electric vehicles at a time where the White House is telling them that the solution to high gas prices is to go buy an expensive electric vehicle for people who are already struggling to make the ends meet with inflation. Another thing to point out is that driving an electric vehicle does not make it carbon-free. As for the actual sourcing of electricity, many electric vehicles would still rely on fossil fuels since they'll be powered by whatever sources are on the electric grid, which brings up the good discussion we have on base load versus intermittent energy. We talk about, quote, renewable energies, but they could also be called intermittent energy. Fossil fuels comprise 60% of the U.S. total electric generation. And to bring up the high gas prices as a reason to support this legislation is disingenuous at best, in the sense that this administration has artificially increased through horrible, horrific energy policies that have literally led to war on a global scale through their energy policies, and that has also caused for high gas prices in the United States, while dumping our energy reserves on the market in an attempt to help get through an election. This is the wrong approach to this. We've got to look at these issues and any sort of transition to electric vehicles in the sight and context of a sound energy policy, and certainly one that would help bring peace and security on the world stage, as well as support our American families and provide the national security element of a strong and thorough base load on our electric grid. Thank you, and I yield back.
Who else seeks? The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chair.
Mr. Higgins, you're now recognized.
Madam Chair, I yield to my colleague, Mr. Norman.
Madam Chair, I have an amendment to the desk.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Basically, what this amendment does to H.R. 7682.
Pardon me?
Please ask him to suspend and ask the clerk to report the amendment.
We need to hear the amendment read. Okay. The clerk will report and clearly read the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7682, offered by Mr. Norman of South Carolina.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Basically, what this amendment does is allows the Postal Service to move forward with its current fleet modernization procurement, and it helps prevent really the meddling from the Biden administration to basically stop a contract that had been awarded back in 21, the end of 21. And again, it's an effort to try to arrive at a different conclusion through an EIS agreement document that will void the contract. I don't think it's fair to the company that took the time to bid it, and the purpose of this amendment is allow the contract to move forward as it's written. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone wish to speak on the amendment? Mr. Comer, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Norman's amendment strikes the requirement that the Postal Service do another environmental impact statement. This would delay much-needed delivery vehicles from getting on the road. Forcing the Postal Service to do another environmental impact statement to get their much-needed vehicles is careless and a complete waste of taxpayer dollars. We should be looking to save, not waste, on this committee. As I stated earlier, the Postal Service released a 340-page environmental impact statement last December. It already included feedback from the EPA. Restarting this effort would be expensive and force the Postal Service to rely on their current delivery vehicles to accomplish their primary mission. That's unacceptable, and I encourage my colleagues to support the Norman amendment. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? Okay, I recognize myself to speak on the Norman Amendment. I am literally surprised by my Republican colleagues who call themselves strong crusaders against government waste would put forward this amendment. It strikes the entire bill and instead encourages the Postal Service to invest in any delivery vehicle, regardless of which vehicle will achieve the greatest cost savings, environmental help, and health benefits for the public. My Republican colleagues also say they're in favor of upholding the rule of law, yet this amendment encourages the Postal Service to violate NEPA, a federal law, by moving forward with its current inadequate environmental analysis. Completing an environmental analysis is required under NEPA, and the Postal Service failed to comply with the law when it used inaccurate information and failed to consider the full environmental impacts of purchasing a gas-guzzling fleet that will be on the road for the next 20 years. The Government Accountability Office made clear at our hearing that the Postal Service used assumptions that were outdated or simply wrong in its environmental impact statement. The Postal Service has a singular opportunity, a once-in-a-generation opportunity to achieve long-term cost savings while also protecting the health of Americans and protecting our planet. So I am opposed to the amendment, and I now ask if there's anyone else who would like to speak to it. If not, the question now occurs on the Norman Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye. Aye.
All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not adopted.
Offer yeas and nays.
The gentleman, a recorded vote has been requested by Mr. Norman. A recorded vote is so ordered. And pursuant to Clause 2 of Rule 11 and Committee Rule 5B, proceedings on the amendment are postponed. Is there any further amendments or discussion? Let me see the other comments. No, there being no further discussion on amendments, we now turn to recorded votes on the pending amendments that have been postponed. In order to coordinate with other committees and give sufficient notices to members, we will recess and take these votes at 12:45. The committee stands in recess.
Sound. Where's the sound?
I think it's electrical, and they're looking into it.
I can't hear you. Sorry, we're gonna go to the vote in just a second as soon as we can get this to work.
So we haven't done the vote yet. Okay.
Hello? There we go. Appears to be working now.
So call the committee to order.
The committee is now in order. It is now in order to take postponed votes. Members are reminded to be ready to unmute themselves when they are called on to vote. Members are further reminded that pursuant to House rules, their video must be on in order for them to vote. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 7535 as amended, which previously was approved by voice vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Norton.
Ms. Norton votes aye.
Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Lynch?
Mr. Lynch votes aye.
Mr. Lynch votes aye. Mr. Cooper?
Cooper votes aye.
Mr. Cooper votes aye. Mr. Connolly?
Aye.
Mr. Connolly votes aye. Mr. Krishnamurthy? Mr. Raskin? Mr. Khanna?
Aye.
Mr. Khanna votes aye. Mr. Mfume?
Mr. Mfume votes aye.
Mr. Mfume votes aye. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez? Ms. Tlaib?
Yes.
Ms. Tlaib votes aye. Ms. Porter?
Aye.
Ms. Porter votes aye. Ms. Bush? Ms. Brown? Mr. Davis?
Mr. Davis votes aye.
Yay, I'm sorry, Brown is a yay.
Somebody else, I'm just telling my own
Ms.
story
Brown
because
votes
I thought
aye.
this was the most.
Mr. Davis?
Mr. Davis votes aye.
Mr. Davis votes aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz?
Wasserman Schultz votes aye.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes aye. Mr. Welch?
Votes aye.
Aye.
Welch votes aye.
Mr. Welch votes aye.
Hi, how is Mr. Krishnamurthy recorded?
Mr. Krishnamurthy, you are not recorded.
Krishnamurthy votes aye.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes aye.
Madam Chair, how am I recorded?
Mr. Raskin, you are not recorded.
I vote aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Sarbanes?
Sarbanes votes aye. He said
Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Ms. Spear? Ms. Kelly? Ms. Lawrence? Mr. Desagnier?
Aye.
Mr. Desagnier votes aye. Mr. Gomez?
Gomez, aye.
Mr. Gomez votes aye. Ms. Presley? Mr. Comer?
Comer votes aye.
Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes aye. Ms. Fox? Mr. Heiss? Mr. Heiss votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Mr. Cloud? Mr. Cloud votes aye. Mr. Gibbs? Mr. Gibbs votes aye. Mr. Higgins?
Aye.
Mr. Higgins votes aye. Mr. Norman?
Aye.
Mr. Norman votes aye. Mr. Sessions? Aye. Mr. Sessions votes aye. Mr. Keller? Yes. Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Biggs? Aye. Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. Clyde? Aye. Mr. Clyde votes aye. Ms. Mace? Aye. Ms. Mace votes aye. Mr. Franklin?
Aye.
Mr. Franklin votes aye. Mr. LaTurner?
Aye.
Mr. LaTurner votes aye. Mr. Fallon?
Aye.
Mr. Fallon votes aye. Ms. Harrell?
Ms. Harrell votes aye.
Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. Donalds? Yes. Mr. Donalds votes aye. Ms. Maloney? Ms. Maloney votes aye.
Is there any member who has not voted?
Madam Chair, this is Corey Bush. How am I recorded?
Ms. Bush, you are not recorded.
Bush votes aye.
Ms. Bush votes aye.
Is there any member who wishes to change his or her vote?
Madam Chair, how am I recorded?
You are not recorded.
I vote yay.
Ms. Presley votes aye.
Brown is there and she's not recorded.
I have 38.
Okay, the clerk will report the tally when ready.
That's what I have. Hmm? They all voted yes. We got 38. On this vote, we have 38 yeas. And 0 noes.
HR 7535 shall be favorably reported to the House. Without an objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the matters considered by the committee in this markup. The question now occurs on favorably reporting HR 7674 as amended, which was previously approved by voice vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Norton?
Congresswoman Norton votes aye.
Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Lynch?
Lynch votes yes.
Mr. Lynch votes aye. Mr. Cooper?
Cooper votes aye.
Mr. Cooper votes aye. Mr. Connolly?
Aye.
Mr. Connolly votes aye. Mr. Krishnamurthy?
Aye.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes aye. Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Mr. Khanna?
Aye.
Mr. Khanna votes aye. Mr. Mfume?
Mr. Mfume votes aye.
Mr. Mfume votes aye. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez? Ms. Tlaib?
Yes.
Ms. Tlaib votes aye. Ms. Porter?
Yes.
Ms. Porter votes aye. Ms. Bush?
Bush votes yes.
Ms. Bush votes aye. Ms. Brown? Ms. Brown? Mr. Davis?
Davis votes aye.
Mr. Davis votes aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz?
Wasserman Schultz votes aye.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes aye. Mr. Welch?
Mr. Welch votes aye.
Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Sarbanes?
Sarbanes votes aye.
Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Ms. Spear? Ms. Kelly? Ms. Lawrence? Mr. Desagne?
Aye.
Mr. Desagne votes aye. Mr. Gomez?
Gomez aye.
Mr. Gomez votes aye. Ms. Presley?
Presley votes aye.
Ms. Presley votes aye. Mr. Comer?
Comer votes no.
Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Jordan? Ms. Fox? Mr. Heiss? Mr. Heiss votes no. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Mr. Cloud? Mr. Cloud votes yes. Mr. Gibbs? Mr. Gibbs votes no. Mr. Higgins?
No.
Mr. Higgins votes no. Mr. Norman?
No.
Mr. Norman votes no. Mr. Sessions? No. Mr. Sessions votes no. Mr. Keller? No. Mr. Keller votes no. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. Clyde? No. Mr. Clyde votes no. Ms. Mace? Mr. Franklin?
No.
Mr. Franklin votes no. Mr. LaTurner?
No.
Mr. LaTurner votes no. Mr. Fallon?
No.
Mr. Fallon votes no. Ms. Harrell?
Ms. Harrell votes no.
Ms. Harrell votes no. Mr. Donalds? Mr. Donalds votes no. Chairwoman Maloney?
Aye.
Ms. Maloney votes aye.
Is there any member who has not voted?
How am I recorded? This is Representative Brown.
Ms. Brown, you are not recorded.
Ms. Brown is an aye.
Ms. Brown votes aye.
To change their vote? The clerk will report the tally when ready.
On this vote, we have 22 ayes and 14 noes.
Okay. H.R. 7674 shall be favorably reported to the House. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the matters considered by the committee in this markup. The question now occurs on the House Amendment to H.R. 6104, which previously failed by voice vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Norton?
Ms. Norton votes aye.
No, no.
Mr. Lynch votes no.
Ms. Norton?
Votes no.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Lynch?
Mr. Lynch votes no.
Mr. Lynch votes no. Mr. Cooper?
Cooper votes no.
Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Connolly?
Nay.
Mr. Connolly votes no. Mr. Krishnamurthy?
No.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes no. Mr. Raskin?
Nope.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Mr. Khanna? Mr. Mfume?
Mr. Mfume votes no.
Mr. Mfume votes no. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez? Ms. Tlaib?
No.
Ms. Tlaib votes no. Ms. Porter?
No.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Bush?
Bush votes no.
Ms. Bush votes no. Ms. Brown?
Nay. No. Brown votes no.
Ms. Brown votes no. Mr. Davis?
Davis votes no.
Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Wasserman Schultz?
Wasserman Schultz votes no.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Johnson?
Yeah, since COVID.
Mr. Sarbanes?
Sarbanes votes no.
Pardon me.
Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Ms. Spear? Ms. Kelly? Ms. Lawrence? Mr. Desagne?
No.
Mr. Desagne votes no. Mr. Gomez?
Gomez, no.
Mr. Gomez votes no. Ms. Presley?
Presley votes no.
Ms. Presley votes no. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes yes. Mr. Jordan? Ms. Fox? Mr. Heiss? Mr. Heiss votes yes. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes yes. Mr. Cloud? Mr. Cloud votes yes. Mr. Gibbs? Mr. Gibbs votes yes. Mr. Higgins?
Yes.
Mr. Higgins votes yes. Mr. Norman?
Yes.
Mr. Norman votes yes. Mr. Sessions? Yes. Mr. Sessions votes yes. Ms. Keller? Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes yes. Mr. Biggs?
Yes, and I.
Yes, and I?
Yes.
Mr. Biggs votes yes.
Trying to help Heiss.
Mr. Clyde?
Yes.
Mr. Clyde votes yes. Ms. Mace? I thought I just saw her. Mr. Franklin?
Yes.
Mr. Franklin votes yes. Mr. LaTurner?
Yes.
Mr. LaTurner votes yes. Mr. Fallon?
Yes.
Mr. Fallon votes yes. Ms. Harrell?
Ms. Harrell votes yes.
Ms. Harrell votes yes. Mr. Donalds? Yes. Mr. Donalds votes yes. Chairwoman Maloney?
No.
Ms. Maloney votes no.
Is
Madam
there
Chair,
any
how am I
member?
recorded?
Mr. Welch, you are not recorded.
I vote yes. No, I'm sorry, I vote no.
Mr. Welch votes no.
The clerk will report the tally when ready.
On this vote, we have 16 yeas and 19 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed say no. And in the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. And the question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 6104 as amended. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed say no.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. 6104 shall be favorably reported to the House.
Someone asked for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. A recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Am I recorded?
Ms. Norton?
Ms. Norton votes aye.
Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Lynch?
Aye.
Mr. Lynch votes aye. Mr. Cooper?
Cooper votes aye.
Mr. Cooper votes aye. Mr. Connolly?
Aye.
Mr. Connolly votes aye. Mr. Krishnamurthy?
Aye.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes aye. Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Mr. Khanna?
Aye.
Mr. Khanna votes aye. Mr. Mfume?
Mr. Mfume votes aye.
Mr. Mfume votes aye. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez? Ms. Tlaib?
Yes, ma'am.
Ms. Tlaib votes aye. Ms. Porter?
Yes.
Ms. Porter votes aye. Ms. Bush?
Bush votes aye.
Ms. Bush votes aye. Ms. Brown?
Brown votes aye.
Ms. Brown votes aye. Mr. Davis?
Votes aye.
Mr. Davis votes aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz?
Wasserman Schultz votes aye.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes aye. Mr. Welch?
Mr. Welch removed. Say his name again.
Mr. Welch?
Mr. Welch votes yes.
Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Sarbanes?
Sarbanes votes aye.
Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Ms. Spear? Ms. Kelly? Ms. Lawrence? Mr. Desagnier?
Aye.
Mr. Desagnier votes aye. Mr. Gomez?
Gomez, aye.
Mr. Gomez votes aye. Ms. Presley?
Presley votes aye.
Ms. Presley votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Jordan? Ms. Fox? Mr. Heiss? Mr. Heiss votes no. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Mr. Cloud? Mr. Cloud votes no. Mr. Gibbs? Mr. Gibbs votes no. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins votes no. Mr. Norman?
No.
Mr. Norman votes no. Mr. Sessions? Mr. Sessions votes no. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes no. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Clyde?
No.
Mr. Clyde votes no. Ms. Mace? Mr. Franklin?
No.
Mr. Franklin votes no. Mr. LaTurner?
No.
Mr. LaTurner votes no. Mr. Fallon?
No.
Mr. Fallon votes no. Ms. Harrell?
Ms. Harrell votes no.
Ms. Harrell votes no. Mr. Donalds? Mr. Donalds votes no. Chairwoman Maloney? Ms. Maloney votes aye.
Is there any member who has not voted? Any member wishing to change his or her vote? The clerk will report the tally when ready.
On this vote, we have 20 yeas and 15 nays.
H.R. 6104 shall be favorably reported to the House without objection. A motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the matters considered by the committee in this markup. The question now occurs on the Norman Amendment to H.R. 7686, which previously failed by voice vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms.
I
Norton?
still have a lot of makeup on my.
Ms. Norton?
Ms. Norton votes no.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Lynch.
Mr. Lynch votes no.
Mr. Lynch votes no. Mr. Cooper.
Cooper votes no.
Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Connolly.
Nay.
Mr. Connolly votes no. Mr. Krishnamurthy.
No.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes no. Mr. Raskin.
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Mr. Khanna.
No.
Mr. Khanna votes no. Mr. Mfume.
Mr. Mfume votes no.
Mr. Mfume votes no. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez. Ms. Tlaib.
Tlaib votes no.
Ms. Tlaib votes no. Ms. Porter.
No.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Bush.
Mr. Payne, are you ready for your question?
Ms. Bush.
Yes, are you ready? We're ready for you.
Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry, Madam Chair.
Ms. Brown.
Brown votes no.
Ms. Brown votes no. Mr. Davis.
No. Davis votes no.
Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
Wasserman Schultz votes no.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes no. Mr. Welch.
He's there.
Mr. Welch.
No.
Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Sarbanes.
Sarbanes votes no.
Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Ms. Spear. Ms. Kelly. Ms. Lawrence. Mr. DeSagne.
No.
Mr. DeSagne votes no. Mr. Gomez.
Gomez, no.
Mr. Gomez votes no. Ms. Presley.
Presley votes no.
Ms. Presley votes no. Mr. Comer.
Comer votes yes on the Norman.
Mr. Comer votes yes. Mr. Jordan. Ms. Fox. Mr. Heiss. Mr. Heiss votes yes. Mr. Grothman. Mr. Grothman votes yes. Mr. Cloud. Mr. Cloud votes yes. Mr. Gibbs. Mr. Gibbs votes yes. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Norman.
Yes.
Mr. Norman votes yes. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions votes yes. Mr. Keller. Yes. Mr. Keller votes yes. Mr. Biggs. Mr. Biggs votes yes. Mr. Clyde?
Yes.
Mr. Clyde votes yes. Ms. Mace? Again. Mr. Franklin?
Yes.
Mr. Franklin votes yes. Mr. LaTurner?
Yes.
Mr. LaTurner votes yes. Mr. Fallon?
Yes.
Mr. Fallon votes yes. Ms. Harrell?
Ms. Harrell votes yes.
Ms. Harrell votes yes. Mr. Donalds? Yes. Mr. Donalds votes yes. Ms. Maloney?
No.
Ms. Maloney votes no.
Is there any member who has not voted?
Madam Chair, this is Corey Bush. How am I recorded?
Don Grace is the
She is not recorded.
Bush votes no.
Ms. Bush
Madam
votes
Chair.
no.
This is Wasserman Schultz. I know I was recorded, but I'm just double checking. How am I recorded?
Ms. Wasserman Schultz, you are recorded as no.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
This is Ms. Brown. How am I recorded?
Ms. Brown, you are recorded as a no.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Does any member wish to change his or her vote? The clerk will report the tally when ready.
On this vote, we have 15 yeas and 20 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. Amendment in the nature of a substitute. The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. 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 All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a recorded vote has been requested. A recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
No. Do you want it on the ANS or on the bill? Okay, so this is the ANS. You withdraw that.
Ms. Norton?
No, suspend. The clerk will suspend.
Norton votes aye.
The clerk will suspend.
The clerk will suspend. Mr. Heiss has a unanimous consent to withdraw his request for a vote on the ANS. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. Final passage. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 7682 as amended. All those in favor say aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. A recorded vote has been requested. A recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Norton?
Ms. Norton votes aye.
Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Lynch?
Mr. Lynch votes aye.
Mr. Lynch votes aye. Mr. Cooper?
Cooper votes aye.
Mr. Cooper votes aye. Mr. Connolly?
Aye.
Mr. Connolly votes aye. Mr. Krishnamurthy?
Aye.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes aye. Mr. Raskin? Mr. Raskin votes aye. Mr. Khanna?
Aye.
Mr. Khanna votes aye. Mr. Mfume?
Mr. Mfume votes aye.
Mr. Mfume votes aye. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez? Ms. Tlaib?
Tlaib votes aye.
Ms. Tlaib votes aye. Ms. Porter?
Aye.
Ms. Porter votes aye. Ms. Bush?
Bush votes aye.
Ms. Bush votes aye. Ms. Brown?
Brown votes aye.
Ms. Brown votes aye. Mr. Davis?
Davis votes aye.
Mr. Davis votes aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz?
Wasserman Schultz votes aye.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes aye. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch?
Here it comes. Mr. Welch. Yeah. Say his name again.
Mr. Welch?
Votes yes.
Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Sarbanes?
Sarbanes votes aye.
Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Ms. Spear? Ms. Kelly? Ms. Lawrence? Mr. DeSagne?
Aye.
Mr. DeSagne votes aye. Mr. Gomez?
Gomez aye.
Mr. Gomez votes aye. Ms. Presley?
Presley votes.
Ms. Presley votes
Votes aye.
aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Jordan? Ms. Fox? Mr. Heiss? Mr. Heiss votes no. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Mr. Cloud? Mr. Cloud votes no. Mr. Gibbs? Mr. Gibbs votes no. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins votes no. Mr. Norman? Mr. Sessions? No. Mr. Sessions votes no. Mr. Keller? No. Mr. Keller votes no. Mr. Biggs? No. Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. Clyde? No. Mr. Clyde votes no. Ms. Mace? Does she have to come back? Mr. Franklin?
No.
Mr. Franklin votes no. Mr. LaTurner?
No.
Mr. LaTurner votes no. Mr. Fallon?
No.
Mr. Fallon votes no. Ms. Harrell?
Ms. Harrell votes no.
Ms. Harrell votes no. Ms. Donalds?
No.
Mr. Donalds votes no. Chairwoman Maloney? Aye. Ms. Maloney votes aye.
Is there any member wishing to change his or her vote? The clerk will report the tally when ready.
On this vote, we have 20 yeas and 15 noes.
H.R. 7682 shall be favorably reported to the House without objection. A motion to reconsider it is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the matters considered by the committee in this markup. Before we adjourn, we have one final piece of business which I will dispose of very quickly. Pursuant to notice, I call up the following postal naming bills, which were distributed in advance. H.R. 228, 6404, 7417, 7514, 5976. Without objection, the bills are considered read, and I request unanimous consent for their immediate consideration en bloc. Without objection, the bills are passed. There being no further business, I want to thank all of you for your participation today. The committee stands adjourned. Thank you.